Good evening, everybody. My name is David Gold. I'm a faculty member at the Graduate Program in International Affairs. We are one of the co-sponsors of this event, representing the new school. As most of you are aware, this event was initially scheduled for a month ago. We ran into some difficulties called snow. And when I saw the weather forecast for today, I sort of had a funny feeling that maybe this time it'll be flood. A little biblical, but it didn't happen, so I want to welcome you all. And I'm also grateful to see that there are a few members of the audience who, like me, actually remember the Eisenhower farewell address. Most people here, of course, know it as history. Some of us know it as a reality that we experienced, although in my case, it was more looking forward to the young, vigorous Kennedy administration, but we didn't anticipate looking forward to things like the Bay of Pigs or Vietnam, et cetera. So looking back on Eisenhower, I think, is an extremely important endeavor, and I think we're going to have a really excellent panel. So again, let me welcome you, and I want to turn things over to Andy Breslow from the Nation Institute, who is a major co-sponsor of this particular evening. So again, thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Nation Institute, I want to welcome you all to a conversation that always seems to be a pertinent one in our culture. We're really proud. Nation Books, which is a project of the Institute, recently published Bill Hartung's spectacular book, Prophets of War. We're also delighted we have a number of different authors with us to talk about not only Eisenhower's legacy and warning, but the impact of the military-industrial complex on our culture and politics today. Before we turn things over to our panel, I want to two pieces of business. One, as you'll see over on this side of the room, all of our authors today have their books and will be available to sign books if you should decide to purchase one at the evening's end. And I also want to alert everyone to another great program with our good friends and partners at the New School that we're sponsoring on Thursday. We're sponsoring a conversation about the legacy of the Goldstone Report. And as everybody can imagine, it's 2 years since Justice Goldstone delivered his report on Gaza, but with the swiftly moving events in Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere, the diplomatic discourse in the Middle East is changing incredibly fast. And we're pleased to have former Congressman Brian Baird, current Congressman Anthony Weiner, and New York Times columnist Roger Cohen to talk about this. So I hope you all can join us on Thursday. I'm now going to turn things over to our moderator for this evening's conversation, and that's Sharon Weinberger, who is a distinguished national security reporter focusing on science and technology issues. She's also a Nation Books author of Imaginary Weapons. And she currently is an Alicia Patterson Fellow, and writes for AOL News, Science, Nature, Discover, and a whole raft of other publications. And Sharon will now introduce you to the rest of the panel and set up this evening's conversation. Sharon.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you for joining us here tonight. I think we're going to have a great discussion. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to our authors here. Oh, is this better? Okay. So first we have James Ledbetter, who is the author of Starving to Death on 200 Million, The Short, Absurd Life of the Industry Standard. He's also the author of Made Possible by, The Death of Public Broadcasting in the United States. Most recently, he was the editor of The Great Depression, a diary by Benjamin Roth. He's also the editor in charge of Reuters.com and has been deputy managing editor of CNNMoney.com. And senior editor of Time, working for the magazine's European edition, and editor-in-chief of the Industry Standard Europe. Ledbetter has written about politics and media for Slate, GQ, The American Prospect, The Washington Post, The Nation, The New York Times, Vibe, Mother Jones, and many other publications. We also have down at the far end, we have Bill Hartung, of course, who's an internationally recognized expert on arms trade, nuclear policy, and military spending. He's the author of Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, which is also one of the books featured over here, published by Nation Books this year. And he's the co-editor of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War. His previous books included And Weapons for All, published by HarperCollins in 1995, a critique of U.S. arms sales policies from the Nixon administration through the Clinton administration. Mr. Hodge has authored chapters for has also edited numerous other volumes. Prior to working at the New America Foundation, he served as a senior research fellow at the New York-based World Policy Institute and a speechwriter and policy analyst for the New York State Attorney General Robert Abrams. Finally, we also have Nathan Hodge, who's the author of the new book, Armed Humanitarians, Rise of the Nation Builders. Nathan is a staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal based in Washington, D.C. He's a specialist in defense and national security and has reported widely from the Middle East, the former Soviet Union, and many other countries. A longtime contributor to Wired's Danger Room, a national security blog, his work has also appeared in Slate, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and Jane's Defense Weekly. He's also the co-author, together with me, of A Nuclear Family Vacation, Travels in the World of Atomic Weaponry. So I think with that, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon. I'd like to address, looking at the farewell address that Eisenhower gave just a little more than 50 years ago, the question of state of mind, or as it would be said today, what was he thinking? And it's an important question because I think we have to grapple with what would lead a five-star general, a lifelong pillar of the military-industrial complex, whose administration oversaw the buildup of a nuclear arsenal from approximately 1,000 warheads when he took office to approximately 23,000 nuclear warheads when he left office. What would cause him to turn at the end of his 8 years in office and seemingly say, hey, you got to watch out for that big bad military out there, when he'd been associated with it all his life? This contrast between Eisenhower's personal history and the implications of the speech that he gave, which I think is one of the most profound sort of official critiques of the military ever given by any president in the history of this country. That contrast can be seen, depending on your perspective, as ironic, as contradictory, schizophrenic, or any number of other interpretations. And I don't, as an historian, I don't want to close out any of those interpretations, but I would also add it's that contrast that I think contributes to the speech's enduring power. I think if the speech had been given by a member of Congress or someone in the Senate, we probably wouldn't be here today talking about it. It's in part the speaker, not just the speech. Another reason why it's important is that there is a truism among Eisenhower historians, a truism bordering on a cliche, to analyze his life and his thinking in terms of a balance. Eisenhower always tried to strike a balance, and even in this speech, which you can see in its entirety in the appendix of my book, there's a discussion of the need for a balance. But I would argue that in this farewell address that warned of the dangers of a military-industrial complex, for Eisenhower, the sense of balance had tipped. There was something important that had changed that made his traditional sense of balance, that threw it out of whack. So the question before us is what tipped it? What tipped that balance? I'm going to point to three principal factors. The first is politics and budgets. I think it's fair to say that 1957 it draws a line between the Eisenhower administration, sort of before and after period, more powerfully than any other event during the Eisenhower administration. And I would include in that the Brown versus Board of Education decision and also the McCarthy hearings. I think for the Eisenhower administration, the 1-2 punch in the fall of 1957, represented by the launch of Sputnik and the release of the so-called Gaither Report, created a new dynamic within the administration that was quite different and caused some radical rethinking of the way things had been done. Just very quickly, I think the Sputnik launch is pretty well known. President Obama referred to it rather oddly, I thought, in his State of the Union address, the Sputnik moment. The Soviets launched a satellite in 1957 that scared the heck out of millions of people in this country. The implication for those who were paying attention was that the Soviets were now ahead of us in this very important realm, and it didn't take a lot of imagination to imagine that if they could launch what Eisenhower called one small ball into orbit, that they could easily attach a nuclear weapon to a warhead and create a fearful arsenal. Coming on the heels of this, and I think less talked about today, but 3 days later was the release of something called the Gaither Report, a so-called confidential document, an assessment of the relative strengths, military strengths of the United States and the Soviet Union, that concluded, and again, it's kind of funny which classified conclusions get leaked and which don't, but this concluded that the United States was already behind the Soviet Union in terms of its nuclear capability, or would soon fall behind in its nuclear capability. And taken together, the pressure that this created on the Eisenhower administration was deafening. I can almost think of Eisenhower's sort of tragic figure in these final few years of his administration in the following sense. He knew, and his closest advisors knew, that the numbers that were in the Gaither Report were not accurate. They knew this because they had confidential data from the U-2 spy planes, which at this point had yet to be exposed. They would be exposed in 1960 when Gary Powers was shot down. But they had the preliminary data, which was much more accurate because it was basically what we would think of today as satellite photos, but these were satellites in the form of planes, and they knew that these numbers were nowhere near what the truth was, but you couldn't really say that because the data was confidential. And so what Eisenhower witnessed during this period was a sense that the Democrats in Congress, who were clamoring for higher military expenditures, it's sort of an opposite of the way we think about the political dynamic today, were ganging up with members of the military, particularly in the Air Force, but throughout the various services, to demand greater military spending, better weaponry, more nukes. And Eisenhower, as a lifelong believer in a balanced budget, really couldn't stomach this. And so there developed within the Eisenhower White House in the second half of the second term almost a bunker mentality that the Democrats and the military were out to get them and would in fact distort the record. You could argue whether it was a knowing distortion or an innocent distortion, but the missile gap, which was a major plank of the Kennedy campaign in 1960, was almost immediately shown to be a fiction upon the ascension of the Democrats to the White House in 1961. So you can draw your own conclusions as to whether they were making the numbers up or simply sort of misread them or took the worst case scenario. But from the point of view of Eisenhower and his closest advisors, there was a major distortion going on that was distorting the political process. That's the first thing. The second thing is what I would call Cold War fatigue. Eisenhower, if you read the farewell address, there's almost a confessional aspect to it. He doesn't want to completely divorce himself from his military past, and he never would do that. He had a very proud military past, and justly proud of it he was. But there was a sense that the logic that had taken over, the Cold War logic, wasn't working. He knew it wasn't making us more secure. In fact, he'd given a speech in 1953, shortly upon taking office, known as the Chance for Peace speech, in which he talked about how the masses of money that we were spending on the military weren't in fact contributing to our freedom. If anything, they were locking us into a decades-long struggle that would mean the elimination of our freedom rather than the protection of it. And I think by the time he left office, there was a sense of frustration and a sense of confession to the American people about this being the case. And you get this if you look through the correspondence between Eisenhower and his various confidants in the second term. You begin to get what I call a series of nuclear fantasies, and I mean fantasy in the psychological sense. I don't mean to say that he was in any way divorced from reality, but he was trying to force a solution to a problem that just seemed to be multiplying. For example, he began to seriously consider during this period the idea of a global plebiscite in which every adult throughout the world would vote. Would you rather be ruled by a communist system? Would you rather be ruled by a democratic capitalist system? This was probably never going to happen, and was perhaps largely considered for propaganda purposes. But it was one of the things that Eisenhower was thinking about as a way of trying to get out of the seemingly locked logic of the Cold War. Similarly, and perhaps slightly more plausibly, he contemplated fairly seriously the idea of a massive student exchange on the order of tens of thousands of students per year between the Soviet Union and the United States, actually drafted a speech in which this was going to be proposed in fairly detailed and fairly concrete terms, and at the last minute decided not to give that speech. The State Department wasn't really crazy about the idea of Russian students, being allowed to attend universities that happened to be near military installations and this sort of thing. The State Department was very good at coming up with reasons to shoot things down, even after the death of John Foster Dulles. And so this too never really saw the light of day, but I think it demonstrates that he was really straining intellectually to find some way of getting out of the dynamic that had created this morass. The final factor that I'm going to point to is going to sound strange, but it was advertising. Over and over again, as I went through the material, both from Eisenhower himself and from many people around him, people pointed out that among the speechwriters, among the military advisors, and Eisenhower himself, in the White House, they would subscribe to these magazines like Aviation Week, and they would sort of look at them and flip through them and see all these ads for, major weapon systems. And it's a startling development if you keep in mind that this industry, the sort of industry that catered to the burgeoning class of nuclear weapons and fighter planes didn't even exist a decade or 2 decades before, that they were spending all this money, in many cases taxpayers' money, right? Because these were companies that got government contracts, and so they were spending this money to advertise. And it's a very peculiar system. When you think about most advertising seeks to sell a product or a service to a maximum audience. However many people they can reach for the money that they're willing to spend, they try to do that. In this case, there was only one real possible audience for advertising a weapons system, and that was the Pentagon itself. And Eisenhower and his advisors found this very strange and very distorting. And I'm going to just, if I can, read a portion of my book where I talk about this. To flip through these publications in the late 1950s was to peer into an otherwise hidden America, where prosperity and security seemed to orbit solely around a single vast and growing industry. Aviation in 1957 was approximately an $11 billion business, with giants like Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and General Dynamics bringing in more than $1 billion each in annual revenue. Nearly all of that revenue came from military contracts, and these magazines were where military contractors hawked their goods. There were also ads for the raw materials needed to make planes and rockets: titanium, graphite, rubber, stainless steel, aluminum. Layered on top of that were dozens of sub-industries that straddled the line between public subsidy and private enterprise: makers of helicopters, circuit breakers, aircraft bolts, aircraft engines, roller bearings, navigation and radar systems, aircraft spark plugs, rockets, you name it. And it won't surprise those of us who work in the media that when you have an industry that's being so heavily when you have a publication that's being so heavily funded by an industry like the military, it tends to have an influence on the editorial product that these publications put out. And so this is an excerpt from an editorial that ran in Aviation Week just after the Sputnik launch. They said that Americans have a right to know the facts about the relative position of the U.S. and the Soviet Union in this technological race, which is perhaps the most significant single event of our times. They have the right to find out why a nation with our vastly superior scientific, economic, and military potential is being at the very least equaled and perhaps being surpassed by a country that less than 2 decades ago couldn't even play in the same scientific ballpark. They also have a right to make the decisions as to whether they want their government to maintain our current leadership of the free world regardless of the cost in dollars and sweat, or whether they wish to supinely abdicate this position in favor of enjoying a few more years of the hedonistic prosperity that now enfolds our country. These are choices the citizens of this land must make for themselves. They are not decisions to be made arbitrarily by a clique of leaders in an ivory tower or on a golf course. This was a dagger aimed directly at Eisenhower, who was a very famous golfer. And so it's not that hard to think about that editorial and many, many more like it being read in the Eisenhower White House and sort of where is this stuff coming from? Well, it's coming from those companies that make all the advertisements that are running in these publications. And so I will close by just saying it's important, and it's very tempting, I think, to savor the contrast between what Eisenhower said in this speech and how the idea of a military-industrial complex has evolved in the subsequent half century. But I think it's equally important, in order to understand where it came from, to look at points of continuity between earlier parts of what Eisenhower went through and what this speech had to say. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And before moving on to Bill, I want to mention 2 things. First, that I'm a former editor and writer with Aviation Week, so it's a good perspective on things. And also, I forgot to mention actually the full title of his book, which is Unwarranted Influence, Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. So, moving on.
Excuse me, I have a cold, so if I sound a little strange, that's why. I was going to talk about the military-industrial complex in action as it currently functions. And the issue of advertising comes into play, so it was a good segue. But one thing I wanted to think about, I gave a talk at the Watson Center at Brown University a couple weeks ago, and I sort of gave chapter and verse about Lockheed Martin and how the lobby works and what they've done over the years. And one of the first questions was, Bill, can you give me some hope here? What am I supposed to do with this information? And so I took that to heart. So I'm going to look at the same information from a slightly different angle, which is to say that as powerful as it is, the military-industrial complex is not all-powerful. They don't win every battle. They don't keep the budget at high levels indefinitely. It's an active process that the lobby goes through to try to get what it wants, and it's not always successful. In the case of Eisenhower, one of the things that he had to fight against was the Air Force and the contractors wanting to build a new bomber, the B-70. And he was able to stop them from doing that, albeit with a great amount of energy going into it, and still having to deal with a lot of political ramifications of the arms lobby, as James mentioned. So I think there's kind of this sense that, the complex is 10 feet tall, can never be beaten. I don't really believe that. And I'll make a few other references to why that is. The first chapter of my book is about a battle that Lockheed Martin lost, their attempt to keep the F-22 combat aircraft in production beyond what the Pentagon wanted to build. And I'll just read a little bit from the book to give a flavor of that battle. And as I mentioned, it starts with advertising. It is a striking ad. An intimidating combat aircraft soars in the background with the slogan up front in all capital letters, 300 million protected, 95,000 employed. The ad for Lockheed Martin's F-22 Raptor was part of the company's last gasp effort to save one of its most profitable weapons from being terminated. The pro F-22 ad ran scores of times, in print, on political websites, even in Washington's Metro. One writer at the Washington Post joked that at a time when many companies had been cutting back on their advertising budgets, Lockheed Martin's barrage of full-page ads in February and March 2009 was the main thing keeping the paper afloat. As soon as there was even a whisper of a possibility that the F-22 program would be stopped at only 187 planes, about what the Pentagon wanted, but only half of what the Air Force and Lockheed Martin were striving for, the company started racking up big numbers on its side. By early 2009, months in advance of President Barack Obama's first budget submission to Congress, Lockheed Martin and its partners in the F-22 project had lined up 44 senators and 200 members of the House of Representatives to sign on to a Save the Raptor letter. They also got a number of governors, including David Patterson from New York State. At the heart of the lobbying campaign was the mantra of jobs, jobs, jobs. Jobs in 44 states, or so the company claimed. Lockheed Martin's PR barely bothered to mention whether the plane is needed to defend the country. That argument was there in the background, but it wasn't the driving force. Lockheed's ads for the plane got more and more specific as time went on, with the series showing people at work on components of the plane with legends like 2,205 F-22 jobs in Connecticut, 125 skilled machinists in Helena, Montana, 50 titanium manufacturing jobs in Niles, Ohio, and 30 hydraulic system specialists in Mississippi. All that was missing were ads for 132 lobbyists, Washington, D.C. And I sort of just threw that number out there, but I decided to look into it. Lockheed Martin employs 32 outside lobbying firms, as well as having its own internal lobbying force. So my guess is that throwaway number is probably a conservative figure. Now, as the debate moved to Congress, one of the reasons that Lockheed Martin lost was because there was bipartisan opposition. One of the few things that John McCain and Barack Obama agreed on was the need to stop this plane. And so on the floor of the Senate, what McCain said was the following: "This amendment is probably the most impactful amendment I have seen in this body on almost any issue, much less the issue of defense. It boils down to whether we are going to continue the business as usual of once a weapon system gets into full production, it never dies, or whether we are going to take the necessary steps to reform the acquisition process in this country." He then went on to cite several paragraphs from Eisenhower's speech and talked about the need for an alert and knowledgeable citizenry to keep it in its rightful place. And that was a phrase from Eisenhower. And he suggested the only thing that he would amend in the Eisenhower speech was to replace military-industrial complex with military-industrial congressional complex to take into account the role of Congress. So as I said, Lockheed Martin lost this battle, and I think there were four major reasons, plus a little surprise at the end, which I'll get to. First of all, it had no purpose. It was the most expensive fighter plane ever built, originally designed to fight a Soviet fighter that itself was never built. They kept trying to come up with rationales for it, and were not particularly successful. Finally, Secretary of Defense Gates said, well, we're fighting two wars, and we're not using this thing. Even if we stop building them today, we're going to have a large margin of superiority over China 10, 15, 20 years down the road. We can't afford this thing. In addition, Gates and Obama really fought this fight. I wish Obama would fight some other fights as doggedly as he fought this one. He threatened to veto any defense bill that included the F-22. And colleagues of mine who've worked in the business say that that's nearly unprecedented, to focus on one system and say, you give me a Pentagon bill with that, I'm going to veto it. There was also the bipartisan opposition, as I mentioned, not just John McCain, but people like Jim DeMint, who was one of the biggest Tea Partiers and one of the most avowed enemies of President Obama, also voted to kill the plane. And I think their false economic claims probably hurt them, or at least they didn't get the traction they hoped. I looked at the jobs claims, and it appeared that by standard estimating procedures, maybe there were 35 or 40,000 jobs involved, not the 95,000 that they claimed. Probably was not present in 44 states. If so, it probably would have been a slam dunk for them. 44 states, 88 senators. They would have really had a pretty easy go of it. And finally, and this is a little surprise, is they got a little party favor at the end, which was that they cut the F-22, which was a $4 billion per year program at that point, and added $4 billion to the F-35, another Lockheed Martin fighter plane. So a lot of the same contractors, a lot of the same districts, a lot of the same states were involved. So in a sense, you have to put sort of an asterisk next to this victory against the company in that it was taken care of. Of course, now the F-35 is having its own difficulties, and those funds may not flow as quickly or in as great quantity as Lockheed Martin might prefer. I think the thing about the complex now and a company like Lockheed Martin is it's much larger and it has much greater reach than anything Eisenhower could have imagined. Military spending now is about twice what it was when Eisenhower gave the speech, adjusted for inflation. And Lockheed Martin itself gets $36 billion in government contracts every year, mostly from the Pentagon, also from the CIA, also from the FBI, also from Homeland Security, also running a nuclear weapons lab for the Department of Energy. So they have a number of military and security-related contracts beyond what they get from the Pentagon. And to give some sense of what this means, if you divided it up among every tax-paying household in America, it would be about $260 per household. And I've been authorized to collect those checks this evening. So you can make them out to me, and I will sign them over to Lockheed Martin. Also, as we were discussing beforehand, it's significantly larger than the budget for the U.S. State Department. So you've got one weapons contractor getting more money from the government than our own State Department, about 4 times what the Environmental Protection Agency receives, enough to give food stamps to 28 million people, or a low-income energy, but with just about a fifth of that money, you could provide for 9 million people, heating in the winter, and people who can't afford to heat their homes. So this is a large company, but it's also got significant reach beyond the Pentagon, as I suggested. They have Pentagon contracts, they have Department of Energy contracts, Homeland Security contracts, CIA contracts, National Security Agency contracts. They work for the FBI, the IRS, the U.S. Census. They're digitizing our national archives. They work for the Federal Aviation Administration, about 24 government agencies in all. So it's more than just weapons building. They have a much greater reach than anything Eisenhower would have anticipated. And they sort of run their own foreign policy. Until recently, they were hiring interrogators for Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, recruiting and putting them in place. They were building refugee camps in the Sudan. They were helping reform the justice system in Liberia. According to one report, they had a person helping write the Afghan constitution. They were recruiting election monitors for the Ukraine and Bosnia. So there's this whole kind of global reach that's really unlike anything Eisenhower would have dreamed of. And so now I know I'm supposed to be talking about how we can beat these guys, but first I got to build them up before I knock them down. I want to talk a little bit about the tools of influence that they can use, and then I'll close with a few examples of things that are happening currently. And if I go too far, you should get the hook out, because we can always get into it in the discussion. So the one obvious tool they have is the jobs issue, which in most circumstances is enough to win the day. It was not in the case of the F-22. They have campaign contributions and lobbying money, of which they spend about $12 million per year on that, which is not a lot compared to, say, the pharmaceutical industry, but it's very well placed. They're the biggest contributor, for example, to Buck McKeon, who's the new head of the House Armed Services Committee, biggest contributor to Daniel Inouye, who heads the Senate Appropriations Committee, and has proudly called himself the #1 earmarks guy in the Congress. He didn't get the memo about how we're supposed to be against earmarks now. And then they have these little party favors they give out, things like $1 million to the Trent Lott Leadership Institute at the University of Mississippi. The Johnstown, Pennsylvania Orchestra was lavish with donations from Lockheed Martin because the wife of the late Jack Murtha, it was one of her favorite charities. Back in the older days, there was a guy named Mendel Rivers who ran the Armed Services Committee in the 60s, his slogan was Rivers Delivers because of the amount of pork he brought into his district. They made a bust of Rivers in the downtown of his city. Lockheed Martin, Lockheed at the time helped pay for that. So you've got these little side deals that aren't really kind of the main thrust, but it just, help cement relationships. And then you've got the revolving door, which is the movement of people from the companies to the Pentagon, from the Pentagon to the companies, creates kind of a convergence of interests, sometimes very serious conflicts of interest. And William Proxmire gave a good synopsis of why this is a problem. Do I have Proxmire here? I may have taken him out. We'll leave Proxmire for later. But basically what he was saying was, if you're on the inside looking forward to getting a job on the outside, you're not going to drive a very hard bargain with the company that you're dealing with. And the most extreme example of this was the Boeing tanker project, where Darlene Druyan, a Pentagon procurement official, was getting jobs for her relatives with Boeing, negotiating her salary with Boeing, all while she was still in the government. She ended up doing 9 months in jail for this because Senator McCain dug up all the email traffic that sort of served as a smoking gun. Things probably like this, but not quite as extreme, probably happen every day. Brian Bender, who writes for the Boston Globe, did a piece recently that said of 39 generals and admirals who retired in one recent year, 34 of them went to work either for defense companies or set up their own defense consulting companies. So this is sort of standard, operating procedure. It's not nobody's retiring to play golf in the Eisenhower mode. And then another sort of lever of influence is service on government panels. You'll have panels looking at things like, future air power threats to the United States, future uses of stealth technology. Is North Korea going to develop a missile that can hit the United States? And all of these kinds of panels are packed with people from the contractors who have an interest in the outcomes. There's also a lot of contributing to think tanks. And I don't think it necessarily influences the think tanks, but it gives them a greater platform. So you have a guy like Frank Gaffney, who has since gone completely off the deep end, going around the country talking about how we're going to be subjected to Sharia law. But back when he worked on defense issues, he was a big booster of Star Wars. And he left the Reagan administration because he thought they were too liberal on nuclear issues. So anyway, he started this think tank with money from Lockheed, from Martin Marietta, from Boeing, from Northrop Grumman. Many of the contractors were on his board. They helped push through an act in the late 90s that said it's now the policy of the United States to deploy a missile defense system. It wasn't clear that it needed to work or be affordable, but the policy was supposed to be that we would nonetheless deploy one. And it's a bipartisan effort. It's not just conservative think tanks. It's not just Republican-leaning think tanks. The Center for a New American Security, which was founded by Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy, who were in the Clinton Pentagon and now have high positions in the Obama administration, it was quite straightforward about this. They list all the military contractors who fund them on their website. And Kurt Campbell was asked about this by Senator Jim Webb when he was confirmed. And his basic response was, well, everybody else does it, and we're not getting as much money as them. He also said he didn't see an issue with it, that these people are as concerned with these policies as anyone else, so why not accept contributions from them? There's all these ways to influence policy, some of them more subtle than others. But even so, and this is where I try to knock them down after building them up. And you don't have to agree that I've knocked them down, but you have to at least, give me a shot at it. Even so, I think on key issues, these companies can be beaten. The most recent example was the second engine for the F-35 fighter plane. General Electric has decided that this plane needs a second engine, a competition, so there's two alternative engines available. And this had been pretty much foisted on the taxpayers against the will of the Pentagon for a number of years. This year it was defeated, and it was defeated with the votes of 110 Republicans, including most of the new freshman class, the Tea Partiers and so forth. And this caused some consternation among the rank and file, the old guard, and they were saying things like, well, these people didn't let me brief them, and they're ideologues. They don't understand that they've got, some factors in their district related to this. So I think there's at least some possibility of sort of a left-right coalition on certain of these issues. Now, of course, this was a little easier pickings because this is something the Pentagon didn't want. When you get into things that the Pentagon wants that are viewed as unnecessary for defense, that's a much harder fight, obviously. There was also recently a decision to award a multi-billion-dollar contract for refueling tankers for the Air Force. And this had been the contract that ended up with Darlene Druyan going to jail. But finally it was awarded to Boeing, now these many years later. And one of the interesting things about that is we talk about the arms lobby and the campaign contributions and so forth. The two adversaries in this competition were spending money against each other, basically, to see who could win the contract. So they weren't spending the money necessarily to jack up the defense budget per se. So not all of that lobbying power goes into, picking our pockets per se. Some of it goes into the battle within the complex. And then finally, the reason I think we have an opportunity now is because of the fight over the deficit. I was part of a group called the Sustainable Defense Task Force that has put forward a proposal for cutting about $100 billion a year out of the Pentagon budget, which is a substantial amount, but it would still leave us quite a bit higher than where the budget was when George W. Bush came into office. Representative Barney Frank and Ron Paul of Texas have sort of, put their weight behind this, and they've got about 50 members with them. Not a huge number, but about a tenth of the Congress. And the President's Deficit Commission last year proposed cuts of similar levels, close to $100 billion a year. And you've got people like Ron and Rand Paul, the Tea Partiers, as I mentioned, Senator Tom Coburn, a right-wing deficit hawk from Oklahoma, who've all said, if you're going to cut the deficit, the Pentagon's got to be on the table. And so far, Secretary of Defense Gates has kind of managed to kind of play his way around that by making cuts that aren't particularly cuts. I mean, basically, he's saying, well, we wanted this much growth, and we'll accept this slightly lower level of growth. And that's what you're going to get out of us in terms of contributing to deficit reduction. And even in those terms, he talked about $78 billion stretched out over 5 years out of what's been about a $700 billion spending on the military in recent years. So I believe that, just as at the end of the Cold War, the end of the Vietnam War, Iraq is finally winding down. Afghanistan is obviously an open question. But the Pentagon base budget alone, even without the spending on the wars, has grown so dramatically that there's plenty there to look at if you wanted to make cuts. The Pentagon accounts for 56 cents on a dollar of the discretionary budget, the budget that Congress can vote on easily every year, not things like Social Security or Medicare, but basic bread and butter programs, including the State Department, Environmental Protection, Administration of Justice, infrastructure investment, and so forth. So I would close by saying, although there's a great amount of lobbying power on the side of a company like Lockheed Martin, I don't think it's inevitable that they're going to win all these battles. And I think they're entering a period where there's going to be a lot of leverage to prevent them from keeping the military budget at higher levels than it should be. So that's my optimistic note that I would like to end on.
Great, thank you. We've had two people address the military-industrial complex as something that produces weapons, so I think Nathan is going to address sort of a different aspect of that.
Thanks. Thanks again. And if we fast forward from Eisenhower's speech to May of last year, when Secretary of Defense Robert Gates made a speech warning that the post 9/11 gusher, I think as he called it, of defense spending was going to be turned off. He picked an interesting venue for it. It was the Eisenhower Library. Secretary Bill is quite right that Eisenhower really wouldn't recognize the military-industrial complex of the late 50s, early 60s. In today's military, I would argue, and what I argue in my book, is that we see something that we would call more of a military-industrial development complex, and that's a phenomenon that I document in my new book. As Bill pointed out, the Pentagon currently spends about $700 billion a year. If we take about the $400 billion that it spends outside of its walls, about half of that is on sort of the traditional defense articles, your planes, your aircraft carriers, your submarines, your tanks. But half of it is spent on things what they call services, and that can be everything from outsourcing your IT to translation services that you use in the field in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, and it could be for things like private security, a brand new phenomenon that Eisenhower, again, wouldn't have recognized. And it's gotten to the point, interestingly enough, if you go and take a look at the numbers of sort of U.S. boots on the ground, they're roughly matched 1 for 1 by contractors in the field. If I could go back to a moment sort of where I really started to get the idea for working on this book, it was on a visit to Bagram Airfield in the spring of 2002. When a very savvy Army public affairs officer, I think with the idea of trying to keep probing journalists out of trouble while they're waiting for helicopter trips down to an actual battlefield, what was then called Operation Anaconda, was just trying to keep reporters busy at Bagram by taking them around with escorts to take a look at some of the reconstruction work that was going on at Bagram. And Bagram really, at the time, if you looked at it, was sort of like a scene out of Apocalypse Now. So this windswept tent city, there was still a lot of unexploded ordnance lying around. It was not a very pleasant, congenial place to hang out. But they had, the Army Civil Affairs and Army engineers had basically stood up a small task force that they called Task Force Bagram that was charged with basically getting local carpenters together, getting local labor together, and basically starting the very slow and painstaking work of rebuilding a place that had basically been on the front line of fighting between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance that had been really devastated by war and had been really quite a scene of devastation. And it was really interesting to actually see them taking people, and basically they were doing everything from paying them, I think it was $1.70 an hour or something like that, to actually go and sweep the flight line, pick up scrap metal, do all these kinds of basic labor jobs. So sort of giving a shot in the arm to a really devastated economy in that part of Afghanistan. But I also noticed another phenomenon that was going on at the same time, that there were guys who were showing up who weren't in uniform, who were scouting Bagram, and they worked for a company called Brown Root Services, which later became known as KPR. This was one of the companies that started to make a pretty serious mint in the post-9/11 wars in what's called in Pentagon speak, expeditionary support contracting. These are the companies that basically run the camps. They operate the living quarters, they clean the latrines, they run the dining facilities that the troops in combat on forward operating bases all basically live and work out of. They're sort of these, I would sort of describe them as kind of the, I think in the book I call it something like the ultimate gated communities. They're the forward operating bases surrounded by these HESCO bastions, very heavily armed camps that basically Americans have come to operate out of in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the interesting phenomenon that you started to notice was that the people in the military were starting to do lots of very non-military sorts of things. They were going out, in addition to going out on patrols, they were going out and rebuilding schools, they were digging wells, they were putting up electric power lines. Back in 2008, I spent a fair amount of time with the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry, in Sadr City, a pretty rough neighborhood of Baghdad. And the main task, what they were doing at the time, were putting up sewage, water, repairing electricity, doing essentially the work of USAID, the work of aid workers, the work of development. And it was remarkable to see the amount, sort of the fire hose of aid money that was being turned on, just because of the resources that are at the disposal of the U.S. military. Again, it bears repeating. we're talking about an organization that spends north of $700 million every year. It far eclipses what the State Department spends. It far eclipses what the Agency for International Development can bring to bear. I did a little bit of a calculation. I asked civil affairs officers, so how much have you spent over the course of about the 8 months that you've been here doing a lot of these public works projects? And he said, around $72 million. Now, $72 million, if you're in the aid business, is a pretty serious burn rate. You're talking about something that could be the equivalent of a major NGO's, total annual budget. I've talked to some civil affairs officers who had said that they were spending somewhere upwards of $1 million a month in what's called Commander's Emergency Response Program money. This is basically the walking around money that's used to, again, sort of pick up the pieces after combat and help the U.S. win friends and influence people in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. On patrols, infantry officers I saw were given authorized to give microgrants of up to $2,500 to help jumpstart local businesses that had lost inventory in the fighting in Iraq in 2008. It's an extraordinary amount of development money to focus on one section of one neighborhood. And by my calculations, the U.S. probably spent roughly the same amount on aid to all of Botswana in 1 year. That's $72 million. So my book really is about this, interesting new phenomenon, which is the creation of this military and industrial development complex. One of the early laboratories for government outsourcing, interestingly enough, was the Agency for International Development, and things in a lot of ways have come full circle, where we are depending on non-traditional delivery of aid by, for instance, platoon leaders walking around dispensing money, things called provincial reconstruction teams in places like Afghanistan that are blurring the line between traditional aid and development and creating a lot of problems for people who are in the traditional world of aid. And they're trying to learn in a very abbreviated span of time a lot of the bitter and hard lessons that people in the aid and development world have learned over the course of several decades of failed delivery of aid. So it's been a very interesting phenomenon to watch. So if you would look at a place like Bagram today, before and after, today Bagram is sort of a mini city, probably about 20,000 people. It's well lit, it's nicely paved. There are even little signs over the sneeze guard and the dining facility saying no eggs over light. Sort of tells you a little bit about the almost smothering safety culture for deployed forces who live on these large forward operating bases. But it's also become a line of pretty big business. Our traditional stereotype of the military-industrial complex, of the people who bend steel, the people who build ships, the people who build tanks and airplanes, it's just as big of a business in what we would call the services world, expeditionary support. And that's what we've seen over basically the past decade, is this sort of the tipping of the balances in favor of that part of the military-industrial complex, if you want to call it that. So I just conclude briefly by saying that this is something that's a phenomenon that absolutely bears watching, because we're talking about being at the top of we're in an extraordinary difficult fiscal situation right now, and as Bill pointed out, the defense budget is the largest discretionary piece of that, the largest non-mandatory piece. So by all accounts at this point, I think defense is no longer considered something that's taboo. It is definitely on the table, and it's now something that is being discussed, and discussed both on the left and the right, as something that needs a much closer look. So I'll leave it with that, and hopefully look forward to some good questions.
Great, thank you very much to our panel members. I believe there's cards out there for people to write down their questions, so please, if you have a question, write it down on a card and pass it up. While we wait for those, I'll start off with something, sort of a devil's advocate question, which is the advertising question, because it's something that I mentioned I'm familiar with, having worked at Aviation Week. You talked about the defense ads, these sort of ads that are placed specifically in sort of trade publications, but also now increasingly you see them in mainstream media as well. And on one hand, one of the complaints about the defense industry is that they don't act like private industry. They're given subsidies, bailouts, they lobby for funds. On the other hand, if you want them to act like private industry, they're going to do things like advertise. So how do you, what should the defense industry act like? Should they be private industry and try to sell as much product as possible to whoever should buy it? Or should we bring them back more as sort of extensions of government? And how do we resolve that tension?
I don't know that we'll ever, given our system of how we build and pay for weaponry, to say nothing of all the other types of services that Nathan has described, I don't know that we'll ever quite square that circle of the difference between public and private. What I've concluded from researching this is that the United States military gives us all of the bad aspects of industrial policy and none of the good ones. By that I mean we get the sort of lack of competition, we get the support of an oligopoly, we get sort of zero accountability. I mean, I don't know what you have to do to stop being a military contractor. It literally got to the point in the 70s. I keep telling Bill he should hit this point. Lockheed was the original bailout. Lockheed was going to go under in 1971 and had to be bailed out by the United States government, who they were literally too big to fail in the midst of the Vietnam War. So before we talk about advertising as an attribute of what private companies do, there's about 6 or 7 other much more important things that if we believe in a system of free enterprise, we should ask these contractors to do. We're never going to do that. I think a kind of a pipe dream to imagine a truly competitive industry that's going to occupy this space. And I think that's probably why people focus on the advertising aspect, because it's one thing that we could at least theoretically control. There have been attempts over the years from sort of eagle-eyed members of Congress to say, at least please don't pay for the advertising with tax dollars. Because actually, if you think about it, we're paying for it twice. Because the expense itself is tax deductible. Almost all advertising is tax deductible. But of course, it's all fungible, and they're getting the money from somewhere. It doesn't really matter what's paying for the check. And by the way, advertising in the mainstream media by military contractors is not new. The New York Times, the Sunday after Eisenhower's speech, the New York Times noted in it that there had been an ad that week, for a full-page ad for one of the military weapons that Eisenhower had referenced. So this has been with us for a very long time.
Yeah, I would agree with James. I mean, I don't think you're ever going to have a truly competitive arms industry. I think, if you broke up a few of these big companies, maybe you would have, 3 or 4 choices instead of 2 choices. But the competition, a lot of it's going to be lobbying, a lot of it's going to be non-traditional, not market methods. And so I think in that context, the advertising really doesn't bespeak kind of trying to act like a traditional company so much as just throwing another iron into the fire in terms of trying to exert influence.
And if I could throw in one other really interesting point, if you take a trip down to Washington and just look around at some of the advertising in the metro, it's really interesting. A good chunk of those ads they're definitely from the major weapons manufacturers, from the big contractors. But they're also really big advertisers in these specialty publications that go out to Capitol Hill. And that's the other audience that they're trying to reach. It's not necessarily that this is all advertising that you go to the Pentagon metro station and you're going to be plastered with ads for the Joint Strike Fighter Second Engine and for the tanker and all this other stuff. You'll see these ads, but you'll also see them in places like Crystal City. Crystal City was basically kind of known as the house that Reagan built. It's a suburb of Arlington, just across from the Pentagon, where a lot of the contractors have their buildings, but they're also right outside the metro for the congressional office buildings.
There's also a lot of advertising on the web, and there's even Politico has a thing called Morning Defense, which is now brought to you by Boeing. Was brought to you more before that by a European defense contractor. But you'll be reading along the stories, and then in the middle there'll be a little ad for Boeing, and then they'll go ahead with the story. So it's they're looking for every aspect.
Anyone who can sit through the Sunday morning talk shows sees ads for one military contractor after another influence buying exercise.
Great. Did we have one of the questions? Oh. I would like to pull something from the audience, so. Great, thank you. Okay, here's a question. Leaving aside the question of whether the China threat is legitimate, do you see arms manufacturers utilizing this idea as a means to leverage yet more financing from the U.S. government and taxpayers?
Yes. It's actually slightly worse than that, which is when Hu Jintao was here a few weeks ago, and there was this discussion of strengthening the industrial ties between China and the United States. If you read the fine print, some of that involves loosening some of the restrictions about exporting military goods to China. And so the logic of the military-industrial complex is, and always has been, we export weapons to whoever wants to buy them, then use the threat of increased weaponry to say, hey, we need to spend more money here. This has been going on at least since the late 19th century. This is how military contractors make their money.
Before we go on, I actually want to, there's a second question here that relates to it that I think is also very interesting. It asks, does the military-industrial complex skew which enemy is the one to focus on as a present danger, such as Iran being a threat or Pakistan? So maybe we could roll that in with the China one.
I haven't seen that. I mean, I think China certainly works better because you could build traditional weapons to deal with China. Iran doesn't have a particularly good air force. You don't need the huge arsenal we have just to deal with Iran. Whereas if you can kind of gin up China as sort of the threat on the horizon, at least they have the same kinds of weapon systems. You might engage in the same kinds of strategies that you would have done during the Cold War. But, picking up on James's point of selling to the countries and then saying, oh, gee, where'd they get that? We need to, build more. Lockheed actually had an ad for the F-22, a little brochure, where they showed countries with dangerous fighter capabilities that we needed to, get ahead of. And of the 24, 18 of them had gotten their fighters from the United States. Many of them have also gotten their anti-aircraft systems from the United States. So, and there were even people in the industry arguing, well, we got to sell to them because it helps us spread the cost of the technology, and this is a good thing, and don't worry about it, we'll always stay ahead of them. So it's really kind of quite a twisted logic that emerges from that kind of thinking.
It's a very important point that I don't want to let go. One of the aspects of today's landscape that I think would have been impossible for Eisenhower to envision is the degree to which the United States is by far the largest arms merchant in the world. Something like 65 or 70% of market share is to United States companies, and that activity was all but illegal when Eisenhower was president. It began to loosen up in the early 70s, just coincidentally as spending on the Vietnam War was winding down, and a nice shot in the arm for military contractors that you began to see in the early 1970s, and I think that it's an aspect that would have troubled Eisenhower greatly because he did see that along with that kind of cash flow, something. Bill, $40 billion a year in weapons sold abroad, roughly, comes influence that's very, very difficult to counter.
The question that Secretary Gates has always seemed to return to whenever he's been caught up in a debate about a very high-end weapon system like the F-22 is that it doesn't necessarily have any utility for the wars that we're involved in right now. These are basically campaigns against relatively low-tech insurgents. The Taliban doesn't have radar. They don't have their own air defenses. You don't need a fighter that can have stealth and can evade radar and stay invisible to combat that kind of enemy. This is the situation that we're in now, where the military has realized in a very through the very painful and difficult experience of Iraq, that the skills that it needed to prevail were ones that you can't necessarily sell. They're things like cultural skills, language, just an awareness of the communities and the cultures that you're operating in. Now, that's not to say that there aren't companies out there that aren't trying to sell those services. It would be very interesting, and I replay in the book the story of the human terrain system. This was the Army's experiment in embrace of social science as a tool for understanding the communities it was operating in, and it's also branded as a way for reducing the lethality of U.S. operations. And interestingly enough, when the Army decided that they wanted to go out and try to find and reach out to social scientists, anthropologists, ethnographers, where did they go to find them? How did they decide to recruit them? They went to a major defense contractor. It's an interesting story. Not necessarily the most logical way to look, but an interesting part of the story nonetheless.
Great. So the next question is, what is the relationship between the military-industrial complex and American foreign wars? Can they influence intervention? And maybe we'll add into this the military development complex as well.
So does the complex make it more likely we're going to intervene? Is that
Can they influence intervention? Can they influence military decisions, I think is what the question is asking. Are they warmongering in some cases? Or?
Yeah, I think they certainly have made that effort. In the case of Lockheed Martin, one of their VPs was involved in the founding of the Project for the New American Century, which included people like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and the kind of regime change in Iraq crowd. The same VP went on to co-chair the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq, which helped the Bush administration sort of advertise the war. But I think that's sort of secondary. I mean, I think to some degree, the war in Iraq was driven by ideologues to a large degree. I mean, there were certainly security concerns, but in terms of the exaggeration of the threat and so forth, I think it came more from an ideological kind of persuasion than from the contractors themselves.
I would just say, in terms of the temptation to intervene, I would really exhort everyone to go back and take a look at actually the speech that Gates gave at West Point on Friday, which, if I'm going to distill it down to one phrase, is something along the lines of, if you actually think that we're going to be engaging or intervening in countries like this in the future, in Iraq's, new Afghanistan's, they should get their head examined. But what I'm warn about a little bit in the book is that when the military starts to get involved in what I call armed nation building or armed social work, the temptation to intervene in many cases starts to go up. Well, because it's not kinetic. It doesn't involve regime change. It's a gratifying mission in a lot of ways to have. But it avoids the larger question, which is that these tools, the tools that were basically perfected or revived through the embrace of counterinsurgency theory and practice, they're a way of cleaning up spilled milk. They're a way of getting at the fact that you were already in an extraordinary mess and needed to extricate yourself in Iraq. But there's the reverse, which is a case like Haiti, where the military it does have the planning capability. It's got a phenomenal amount of logistics capability. It's got the personnel. It can get there in a hurry. It's got a lot of practice working in crisis situations. But if it goes in, does what it can do best, it restarts the airport, rescues people who are trapped in buildings, but then gets out and doesn't own the problem, that can be an appropriate form of intervention. It's a humanitarian intervention, but it's something that they need to be practice and be able to do, as long as they don't start seeing it as, well, let's look for other failed states that we can intervene and maybe fix them preemptively. So.
Sure. We talked briefly about Secretary Gates's West Point speech, and sort of evoking that military-industrial complex. Did this cause a stir in in establishment circles, his speech? What was sort of the reaction to it from defense industry, from sort of the circle around the military-industrial complex?
I haven't seen major, pushback or commentary on it. Maybe Nathan or Jim have, but I think it's a little tricky for the companies to come out and say openly, what do you mean we shouldn't be fighting wars of occupation? It's not good PR. However, they do finance a lot of people who will make those arguments, a lot of the think tanks and so forth, but that's an indirect connection.
Okay, this one is for Bill in particular. Would your book have yielded the same sort of results, you think, if you'd looked at Boeing or General Dynamics, Northrop, or any of the other big primes? Would the conclusions have been the same or similar?
I think there would have been a lot of similarities. I think, though, Lockheed just is this big, juicy target that just keeps on giving, in the sense that they had the biggest cost overrun in the history of the Pentagon in the 60s with the C-5A aircraft, which they tried to cover up. As Jim mentioned, they were one of the first big corporate bailouts. In fact, Senator Proxmire sort of coined the term corporate welfare to apply to the Lockheed Martin bailout. They were the leader in the bribery scandals of the 1970s, which brought down governments in Asia and Europe and ended up with people going to jail and major political figures. They were behind the the $600 toilet seat and the $7,600 coffee maker. So they were just there at the right time in so many ways. And also, I think more recently, their outreach into all these ancillary areas related to nation building in some ways, related to things like surveillance and information gathering for the domestics front. I think they do a lot more of that than some of these other companies, although they're also trying to get into some of this business. So I think there's some differences, both in terms of their histories of kind of corruption and influence peddling, and then their the kind of reach that they have now, both internationally and domestically. But some of that was just didn't really emerge until I started researching the book. I really went after them because they were the biggest kid on the block in terms of current companies, the largest contractor.
Thank you. This question is for Nathan. How much of the military's budget is put towards development projects, and which projects are prioritized?
Part of it depends on whether or not you include what are called security assistance dollars, or if you're just looking strictly at more traditional kinds of aid. There was, I think it was the OECD has a statistic that's in my book that I have to go get the exact number, but the share of the overall foreign aid pie that's been spent through the Department of Defense has grown probably by a factor of, I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but you're talking about in single percentage points, and then rising to roughly a quarter. And again, that doesn't include what we call security assistance, which includes things like mentoring foreign militaries, police forces, things like that. So, just looking at the big sort of picture of aid, the military has taken on a much bigger share of it. And the amount of resources that they can throw at specific problems is pretty astonishing. Again, I talk about the figure in the book of having civil affairs officers who were overseeing budgets of $1 million a month. If you're from some NGOs, $1 million might be your budget for the year.
It was interesting that you talked about the Commander's Emergency Response Program. In some circles within the military, the slogan about that is "money is a weapon," which I thought was kind of interesting spin on it.
Money is a weapon, and it's actually, I think, cash is a weapon is the title of one of the chapters in the book. The other phrase that you would hear about the non-governmental organizations is we see them, this is military speak again, as force multipliers. I think if you ask a lot of people who are from NGOs or from aid groups, that hell no, we're not force multipliers. We are independent. We're not part of your military operation, and we're not here to enhance it in any way, shape, or form. But again, with the blurring of the lines between traditional aid, development, diplomacy, military action, there is a tendency, I think, for people, especially with these new hybrid military organizations like the Provincial Reconstruction Teams, to see aid in those terms as a tool, another tool sort of in the commander's arsenal or part of the commander's toolkit.
So we have a question, maybe a contrarian question. How do you deal with the fact that during a recession that cutting military dollars might also mean cutting jobs too? And then I'll add on to that was that also an issue in, Eisenhower era?
Yeah, it's been certainly in the entire post-World War II period, there has been a strong relationship between military spending and the economy. I wouldn't say specifically that if you cut $10 billion out of the defense budget in any given year, it means X number of jobs lost. The pipeline and cycle for military contracts is over many, many years, and so you wouldn't necessarily feel the cuts within a given business cycle. But it's certainly something that Eisenhower and the people around him were keenly aware of, and in fact, some of the advisors in the Eisenhower State Department were advocates of what was called the war economy. Keeping in mind, I mean, if you read the Eisenhower speech, he reminds us that for most of the existence of this nation, we didn't really have a standing military. We didn't have a separate military industry. I think before we got involved in World War I, the United States Army was about the size of Romania's, which was pretty small. And that in Eisenhower's phrase, the makers of plowshares could, if asked, become makers of swords as well. And then you would dismantle that military apparatus once the war was over. What happened at the end of World War II is the development of a permanent war economy. Some people actively advocating this, others saying that's socialism in another form or simply a jobs program. Eisenhower was definitely aware that there was a relationship there, and his fear was that the military would get so large that it would sort of eat up too much of the private sector and actually inhibit American growth, which is strikingly similar to the position that, say, many people in the Republican Party take today about government as a whole.
Before we move on, let me just piggyback on to get another question. And someone asked, what is the level of economic return on our defense spending? So that's, you addressed part of it.
Oh, that's a big question. Look, there's no question. If you throw $700 billion a year at anything, it's going to create jobs. It's going to create an economic return. The critical question, I think, from a public policy point of view, is it the most efficient method of return? And this argument also goes to those who would say, well, we get all these wonderful spin-offs from military spending like the internet or Tang or whatever. I think the answer to those things is, well, if that's what we want as a society, why not just spend it directly on that? Cut out the middleman of the military, and it would be tremendously more efficient. And I think any serious, prolonged study that looks into efficiency will show that there are far, far more efficient ways to get the same returns, whether you're talking about technological innovation or job creation. But we don't have the mechanisms for those in this country. What we have is the military. And so that's how we do these things that in other countries get called industrial policy or socialism or whatever you want to call it, EADS. That's our mechanism for doing things that other countries do arguably more directly.
Well, I think the other thing in this budget climate is that continuing to spend on weapons we don't need is going to cost us jobs, because any other expenditure of money, be it on education, be it on health care, be it a tax cut, be it on infrastructure, creates more jobs than spending on weapons. And we're going to be in a period where we're going to see those trade-offs. If you keep spending on a weapon you don't need, it's more likely you're going to have cuts, state and local services, infrastructure investment. So there's going to be trade-offs that will have to be made. And so I think it's not clear that there's really a net gain from staying the course on military production relative to other things that the money would otherwise be spent on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add that one of the interesting features of military-funded jobs, particularly those that require security clearances, they can't be outsourced. And so even if there aren't a lot of them, they retain perhaps a lot more political clout than, say, green business jobs or education jobs, particularly, I guess, in New Jersey.
A question about Congress. Who in the Senate, although I'll extend it to make it Congress, is doing the most to counter conflict of interest issues in defense, and what is the regional distribution of defense interests? I think they mean what is perhaps the regional distribution of defense? Who gets earmarks? Where is the money going?
I can address the second question. It's a very interesting question, and Eisenhower in the late 20s actually wrote a report for an industrial mobilization plan for how to build up the American economy into a war should we enter into another great war as we had during World War I. The contracting process in World War I was completely crazy quilt, and there was a lot of war profiteering and a lot of shoddy materiel, and everybody agreed that the structure that existed then was not right. So the question is, what would it look like? And one of the things that Eisenhower said was, for a variety of reasons, some to do with security and some to do with politics, it's optimal to try and spread the military contracting across the country as much as is practical. But in those days, because it really was an industrial complex, there was a concentration of jobs and therefore presumed economic benefits in places that were industrial, right? So Illinois and Pennsylvania and Ohio, Michigan, places where we actually made physical things. The military budget and the kind of complex of military spending has changed dramatically, as Nathan points out, and so that now a lot of the services that are contracted by the Pentagon have nothing to do with building things in the traditional tank and brick and mortar sense, but rather involve things like software coding and other kinds of services. And so you have seen a tremendous shift geographically, just like with the rest of the country, to the Sun Belt and also the Beltway. So Florida, Arizona, California, Northern Virginia are now the real hubs of where military spending, and they're sort of locked in to those places. Those places' share of military contracting is actually growing over time, while everyone else's is dwindling. There's a woman named Anne Marginson, I think I've got her name right, who's done a terrific book called The Gun Belt about this very issue of distribution of military contracts, and we're heading toward precisely the kind of concentration that Eisenhower 80 years ago recognized was dangerous, but it's not clear that politically anybody really cares about that.
In terms of the Congress, there's a small number of members who are concerned about these kinds of things enough to try to push legislation, do something concrete. One of the more interesting characters is Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, who's a fairly right-wing Republican. He has suggested that the Pentagon budget be frozen until such time as it can be audited. And it's, that could be, hell could freeze over before that would happen. So, but he's using it as kind of leverage to talk about waste in the Pentagon. But I think there's members who sort of discuss it, they raise it, but nobody has made it kind of their issue that they're pushing on in a serious way, the way somebody like Senator Proxmire would have done back in the 60s and 70s.
I mean, McCain certainly has been a consistent opponent of what he would call wasteful government spending, or wasteful military spending. And has been instrumental in investigating some cost overruns and things along those lines. But I have to agree, as odd as it is to say, Tom Coburn, at least on a rhetorical level, seems to be the one fighting it fiercest right now.
And just to chime in, McCain's role, as Bill alluded to, in blocking what he saw as a sweetheart deal for Boeing, it wouldn't have happened without his intervention.
That's right, yeah.
So we just have time for more questions. I'm going to take one that is a little bit broader and that I hope applies to all of the topics we've addressed here. Do you see any realistic possibilities of reversing, this is the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, but let's take it to mean in this sense that the different issues we've talked about, the military-industrial complex, do you see any realistic possibilities for reversing that trend so long as the U.S. continues the war on terror? Or whatever the current incarnation of the phrase is.
Well, I think the war on terror, or there's been various other acronyms like the campaign against violent extremists, but that spells cave, and you don't want to be caving. I think as long as that is, on the top of people's minds, I think it's hard to make these other changes, because even though, as has been mentioned, a lot of these weapons have very little to do with fighting terrorism. I think if there's a level of fear about terrorism, it's harder for people to think clearly about defense. There's a sense of, well, they want somebody to protect them. I don't care what it costs. You guys take care of it. You're the experts. So I think some lessening of some of the exaggerated fears about terrorism would be have a very salutary effect on being able to think clearly about what we need for defense.
I would just add that we're looking at events that are unfolding at such rapid speed in the Middle East, and without, in most cases, without any American intervention or any direct role at all, where people on the streets are the ones who are the prime movers. And this is a case where this isn't this is not U.S. initiated regime change. So I think it may force a little bit of a rethink as to the role of U.S. power and what the limits of U.S. Power are. But we're still dealing with, if we look at a lot of the kind of the theoretical framework that the U.S. military has when it describes the kind of world that it's in, you still see these phrases thrown around, an era of persistent conflict, an era in which we're going to be engaged constantly. If you look at the budget numbers, even it does suggest that we are going to be involved in some way, shape, or form in other countries, and perhaps it's just within the larger conversation about deficits in the fiscal picture that a new dynamic gets injected.
I think the most instructive way to think about the way that the military-industrial complex markets itself is to think about the fashion industry. The war on terror is like that really hip suit that you bought last season. It's kind of wearing out in the elbows a little bit, frayed around the collar. But don't worry, there's a fancy new China suit that's right on the runways now, and a cybersecurity suit next year. As long as you're wearing a suit, as long as you're paying for the suit, they're indifferent.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel members for their time and the audience for their attention and questions. And all of the books are on sale over there. Thank you.